We're going to look now at how Europe and countries across Europe really change during the late 1800s and how they begin to need to kind of take into account this liberalism and this representative government that begins to sweep across Europe, and the changes that are made as a result of that in various societies. So the first one we'll start with Russia, because Russia has some major reforms. And it's because of this, in the mid to late 1800s, Russia is the most backwards nation in Europe. They are almost completely agrarian. They have no industrialization. And at the point that the Industrial Revolution is over, which is in 1850, Russia hasn't even begun. So they're really far back. They're really far back in this. And so that's part of their impetus for reform. The other is that they lose the Crimean War, in part because their army's not modern. They're not moving on trains. They're moving through horses and across muddy roads. So their army's not able to move quickly, and their weapons aren't as precisely manufactured, and so they have real problems here. And so this really embarrassing loss in the Crimean War, leads to a demand for modernization. Look, we need to build more weapons. We need to build more railroads. This isn't working. And then there's also a fear of the revolt of serfs, because people recognize that this social structure is not working and has not led to success in Russia. And so to kind of head that off at the past, you have Tsar Nicholas II, who abolishes, Alexander II, who abolishes serfdom in 1861 in Russia. And so this really leads to a massive overhaul. And of course, this is like a few hundred years after serfdom has been abolished pretty much throughout the rest of Europe. We recall that during the Enlightenment, a full 100-something years before this, most people were getting rid of serfs. So we've got that going on. But in 1861, they abolish it. And very shortly thereafter, the Russian government realizes that this has led to real social chaos, and an absolute monarchy isn't really fit to deal with it. And so the government establishes things called the Zemstvo, and that's local assemblies that are elected. But they're elected kind of on a three-tier system. So, like, the local nobles have votes, local middle class have votes, and the local peasants have votes, and they all kind of share equal power, although the peasants certainly outnumber the rest. So it's not really an ideal situation, but they're created in order to handle this chaos resulting from the freeing of the serfs. And it's another way that we see Russia begin to become more modern in this kind of electoral process, less total monarch control. So we see that. And perhaps the biggest reform that comes out of this is the legal system is reformed. So everyone kind of is now equal before the law. Before, laws were different depending on if you were a serf or if you were nobility or where you fell in the social hierarchy. But now everyone's equal before the law. Again, an Enlightenment idea that shows up in Russia like 150 years late. So that's fun. The Russian Jews are also granted some minor rights for the first time. And censorship is relaxed just a touch. You remember Peter the Great had introduced newspapers, but the only things that were being published were things that were pro-Russian government. It turns out some things don't change, even in 2016. And Russia, the biggest, so those were the big social changes, the biggest economic changes in their industrialization. So we see this massive move towards modernization spearheaded by the government because of their failures. And so there's a huge growth in railroad across Russia. Russia's a massive country, but in 1860 they only had 1,250 miles of railroad, 1,200 miles of railroad. That's not much at all. And they realize that that's not going to be able to sustain a modern economy. So they undergo a huge program to build new railroads. And by 1880, they have 15,500 miles. There's an extra zero on that, but that should be 15,500 miles. And this allows Russia to transport agriculture more quickly. It allows them to move across their vast country and to make more money. So they're moving mostly agriculture at this point, but industry will follow. Because this money that they're making, this extra money by exporting grain, will allow them to reinvest in their country. At the same time, their industrialization strengthens their military, so they can move their military across these vast areas because of these railroads. So they expand to the south and to the east, and kind of get into that expansion mode that the rest of Europe's dealing with as well. So we've got that. And a really important name that we should know is the Russian finance minister, Sergei Witt, and he really draws off the ideas of the German Friedrich List in economic nationalism. That is, a country is only strong when its economy is strong. So he believes that this lack of industrialization, the backwardness of Russia, is really holding it back and diminishing Russia's power and stature in the international community. So he pushes hard for modernization and reform and industrialization. One of his big focuses is on these nationally sponsored railroads. We see this massive growth. But another thing he does is he realizes that because Russia is so backwards, they have to look for new creative ways to do things. So he actually encourages Westerners to invest in Russia and to build factories and to bring their technology. This will then allow Russia to improve at a much more rapid rate than if they had tried to develop this on their own. So by drawing in Western capital and Western resources, he's able to encourage and stimulate Russian growth. And under his leadership, Russia becomes really industrialized really quickly and becomes one of the strongest nations industrially, at least for a time. This leads to some kind of upsetting across social norms, and so eventually we see revolution take hold in Russia for a number of reasons, but one of them is the changes in social structure here. And this unrest starts back in 1881 when Tsar Alexander II is assassinated. And at this time, assassinations are relatively common at this point towards political leaders. For whatever reason, the mid to late 1800s, it's kind of like a high point for assassinations of leaders. Alexander II is quickly followed by Alexander III, who's like, yeah, that whole reform thing, we're not doing it anymore. And so he really kind of negates any gains that were made and stops these advances in reforms. So that's happening in the 1880s. And so that kind of leads to some lingering resentment. Then, in 1904, in part threatened by the Russian expansion and in part because of their militaristic goals, Japan launches a surprise attack on Russia, and within a year hands Russia a devastating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. And this is really an embarrassing defeat for the Russians. It shocks almost all of Europe in the idea we recall social Darwinism, but they had other racial attitudes. They could not believe that an Asian country could possibly defeat a European nation in war, and yet here the Japanese had handily defeated the Russians. So this leads to chaos at home. People are second-guessing everything. On top of that, there's a lot of domestic problems in Russia. Demands for political modernization are rising because they're like, look, we've modernized economically, but we're still stuck, in pre-Enlightenment ideas of legality and freedoms, and that's not going to work. So the kind of educated are upset about that. Factory workers are upset because of industrialization, right? We see that across Europe. And then nationalism is emerging throughout the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is huge. There are a lot of non-Russians living there. Ukrainians, Poles, Czechs, Afghans, Tajiks, tons of different cultures living here. And so all of these elements, combined with the failure of the army and the fact that it was tied up fighting the Japanese, leads to the revolution of 1905. And so this revolution of 1905 starts on a Sunday in January, where workers leading a peaceful protest led by a priest are protesting, and they are fired upon by troops under the command of the Tsar. And this is known as Bloody Sunday. Okay, and so it really sparks riots and chaos across the country. So across the country, you have strikes by labor workers, you have peasants uprising, you have nationalists uprisings. All of these things happening as a result of Bloody Sunday. So it's not just localized, it's not just one group of people, it's across culture, across society, rising up against the Tsar, demanding change. And so eventually the Tsar has to give in. And he issues something called the October Manifesto. So in 1905, the October Manifesto is issued, which grants full civil rights, a popularly elected Duma, which is their parliament, and gives some legislative power to the Duma. And initially, he grants universal male suffrage to elect the Duma. Eventually, these are kind of modified to give more power to the wealthier and take power away from the peasants. So that whole universal male suffrage doesn't last very long in Russia. And this is not necessarily like the October Manifesto isn't something the Russian government was super behind. It's just something they had to do. They were pinned in a corner because everyone was rising up against them, from their factory workers to their peasants to their nationalists throughout the country. Okay, so that's what we've got specifically in Russia. More broadly in Europe, there's some big changes that we should be aware of. And the first is that there's a rise in universal male suffrage. Almost every nation has that. And because of that, we start to see the women begin to demand the right to vote, because they don't believe that it's fair that the men do have the right to vote, but the women don't. And so one of the main leaders of that is a lady named Emmeline Pankhurst. That's a name worth remembering. But in 1914, Norway grants women the right to vote. And that's kind of the first time that women are granted that right in Europe. And so as voting rights spread and more people's voices are heard, the people who are voted into office have to be more responsive to their constituents, to the people who voted them in. And they're more accessible, their jobs are more in danger, so they actually have to take into account the feelings of these people. That's one thing. But in addition to that, governments very quickly learned that in this era of kind of mass media and mass politics, they could shift focus away from domestic problems by creating international incidents and wars. And we saw that Bismarck uses that to kind of gather the support and unify Germany. And speaking of Germany, we'll look at some of these reforms. And it's really easy to get bogged down in these reforms in all these countries, so I want to make sure that we're kind of focusing on the big picture as we go through these. So in Germany, you have a chancellor and a popularly elected representative government. And coming from such a previously authoritarian, absolute monarchy, this is a pretty drastic change. So Bismarck has that going on. And he also leads this thing that he calls the culture Kampf against the Catholic Church. And this is kind of this battle for culture against the Catholic Church, trying to push German nationalism over the loyalty to the Catholic Church. So he's trying to push loyalty to nation over loyalty to religion. So he's got that kind of stuff going on. In 1873, there's kind of a major financial panic and mini stock market collapse that leads to a pretty significant financial crisis. And this leads Germany to implement higher tariffs. Those are protective tariffs, protective taxes on all imported goods. And by doing this, Bismarck and Germany are able to successfully protect their industry as it's kind of still growing. Bismarck also really is afraid of the revolutionary language of socialism and its kind of international appeal. He is at heart a nationalist. Although he comes from a wealthy aristocratic Junker family, his biggest concern with socialism is that it could undercut his nationalism. So his goal then is to kind of cut these guys off at the pass by passing social measures that would make the working class happy. And if they were happy with what the nation was doing, then they wouldn't turn to socialism. So Germany becomes the first country to have a social welfare state. And that happens in 1883 and 1884. They have sickness and accident insurance. They have unemployment benefits. In 1889, they establish old age pensions. These are way ahead of their time. And for the first time, there's a social welfare state, and that first state is Germany. German socialists eventually start to gain more power as Wilhelm II takes over. But these socialists are not nearly as radical as Bismarck feared, and they're focusing more on gradual social and political reform, operating through this popularly elected Reichstag, which is their parliament. So that's what we got going on in Germany. In France, you kind of have this era of tumult and chaos, and that's a result of the Franco-Prussian War. France is really kind of disenchanted with their country after they lose. People don't know how to react. And so there's a small group of French Republicans who are wildly offended when France surrenders to Germany. and they actually declare a new country, or a new government. They basically say, we have not surrendered, that government doesn't speak for us. They call themselves the Paris Commune, and they formed that in 1871, right after they've been defeated. And they refuse to admit this defeat to the Prussians. They're very radical in their Republican ideals. People freak out about this, and they launch an attack, eventually crushing this Paris Commune. And so there's a lot of turmoil, and France is unsettled for a number of years after this. There's kind of monarchists, there's moderates, there's Republicans, kind of across the board. You have people in every kind of political stance who are making their pushes. And finally, there's this funny moment where they finally decide that they're going to invite a member of the Bourbon family to come back to be the King of France. And he says, okay, I'll come back, but on one condition: you got to get rid of the red, white, and blue striped flag. That's the flag of the revolution. And replace it with my family's flag, which is the white flag with the fleur-de-lis on it. Okay, that's his condition for becoming the king. And they say, no, we're going to stick with this flag that we earned in the revolution. And so this guy decides that, fine, it's not worth it. I'm not going to become king. So France remains in this kind of state of turmoil and shock, and this lasts all the way through World War I. But despite this, there are some reforms under this moderate republicanism that kind of takes hold in France. And the two biggest ones, the first is kind of the legalization of trade unions, allowing unions to exist, which is a huge step for workers. And then secondly is free compulsory education for boys and girls. And so it's required that both boys and girls go to school, and the government is going to pay for it. And so that's a really big change. In the midst of all of this, there's kind of this really important historical event that undercuts something we'll talk about later, which is anti-Semitism and Zionism. And that's something called the Dreyfus affair. And so there's a guy, his name is Alfred Dreyfus. He's a captain in the French army, and he happens to be Jewish. He is accused of selling military secrets to Prussia. You got to remember, at this time, France is looking for a scapegoat for why they lost the war to Prussia. And so this is it. They demand that they insist that people like Dreyfus had sold their secrets and sold them out. And so in France you have this rising tide of anti-Semitism because people believe that the Jews had sold them out to the Prussians. And this Dreyfus affair really splits France in half because Dreyfus is framed. He's wrongly accused. He's completely innocent. But there's this kind of witch hunt mentality to get anybody who had hindered France and had caused their loss. And so this massive anti-Semitic movement takes place, and the French army is insisting that their investigation has been thorough, and when it is revealed finally that he actually is indeed innocent, it leaves kind of a black eye on the French army. And it also stirs up these anti-establishment feelings, not only against the French army, but also against the Catholic Church, a number of whom had led this charge against Dreyfus. And so this leads the government to split further from the Catholic Church, kind of ending the interrelations they had had since before the French Revolution. In Great Britain, you have this moment where the House of Lords tries to gain back some of the power that they had lost a few years earlier when the House of Commons had been expanded, but they end up failing in part because of the passing of something known as the People's Budget, which focuses more on the common man and again establishes a nationalistic, socialist state where there is national health insurance in the late 1800s, unemployment benefits, and old age pensions for British workers. So we've got that going on, and Britain is also dealing with their Ireland problem. And what happens is Ireland finally sees a chance where they can push for self-rule and independence because of this chaos in Parliament, because of these movement towards the common people. The problem is that in Ireland you have two major groups. You have the Northern Irish, who are generally of English descent, are Anglophiles, they lean towards England, and are Protestant. And then everywhere else in Ireland you have the Irish, who are Catholic and very strongly anti-English. And so they're not really able to unite at this time. And then World War I kind of interrupts this push for Irish freedom. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have the Hungarians continuing to push for independence despite their failure in 1848. But they finally find an opening after Austria is defeated in the Austro-Prussian War. And so they demand this freedom, they push for it, they push for it, they push for it, and finally Austria has to accept what is known as a dual monarch. Essentially, we're going to have two kings of the Austro-Hungarian Empire now. One will be Austrian, one will be Hungarian. And the Hungarian dude's going to take care of his side, the Austrian guy's going to take care of his side. That'll be that. And so the empire is really pretty much split in two, although they remain a single entity. And each side, the Austrians deal with Austrian problems, the Hungarians deal with Hungarian problems. And each of them really kind of try to quash nationalism on their own. And that's kind of ironic for the Hungarians, who had pushed so hard to be free. Across Austria, there's a failure to enact meaningful reforms because everyone's so split amongst different minority and ethnicity. So Austria is kind of this unique case in Western Europe, in that those countries got strengthened because of nationalism. Places like Germany and France and Italy. Meanwhile, Austria really falls apart because of nationalism. A major kind of undercurrent in society at this time is rising anti-Semitism. For a long time, hundreds of years, Jews had been excluded from European nations, excluded from taking any really important roles. But their involvements in the revolutions of 1848 helped to change that, as well as the basic freedoms that had kind of been enacted in a number of countries. And by 1871, they had seen some pretty significant progress. An example of that is in Germany, where Jews could now marry whoever they wanted, they could live wherever they wanted, and they could own whatever property they wanted. Before that, they couldn't. There were significant restrictions on what they could do. So you have this real kind of growth of Jewish acceptance. And during this time period, many Jewish people had improved their economic status because of sound investment, because, well, there's a number of reasons, but sound investment, and they kind of take the lead in the Industrial Revolution because they have money to lend. They're involved in banking and railroads and things of this sort. However, when the economy collapses in 1873, people naturally look for someone to blame, and they fall on the Jewish people who had been so profitable during this early rise of industrialization. And so as anti-Semitism grows, it grows out of this economic collapse. And so across Europe, you have anti-Semitic political parties gaining power. One of the biggest ones is in Vienna, Austria. There's a mayor there named Karl Lueger, who's really anti-Semitic, supremely anti-Semitic, and starts his own political party there and gains a lot of power and basically makes Vienna a place where Jews are not welcome. In addition, in Russia, the Russian government recognizes that they can use the Jewish people as a scapegoat to turn frustration and animosity away from the government, so they do that. And the result is a series of deadly pogroms in mostly southern and southwestern Russia, where Jews are beaten, they're killed, their property is taken from them, their goods are taken from them, and the state just completely endorses it. And this, like Karl Lueger, and these pogroms and various other anti-Semitic incidents leads to this rise in Zionism. And Zionism is this idea that the Jewish people should have their own home state of Jewish people, for Jewish people, by Jewish people. And so this idea starts to gain momentum because life in Europe is so crappy for the Jewish people. And the name to know behind that is Theodor Herzl. And he was a German nationalist until he saw all the crap Karl Lueger was doing to Jewish people. He's like, okay, we can't live in harmony with people like this. We need our own place. So all that's kind of happening domestically in various countries. On an international level and more broadly, there's this idea of international socialism, and it's pushed by Karl Marx, who creates a thing known as the First International. And this is a political organization. The first one fails, but the second one grows. And what it is it's a gathering of representatives from every national socialist party. They can gather, they can say, these are our problems, these are our successes. It was a way for them to kind of have this international community of socialists that Marx had so long pushed for. At these gatherings, one of the main achievements is the use of May Day, May 1st, as a one-day annual strike. Now, these end up kind of losing their luster because working class people begin to gain rights and protections in other ways. And that's in large part because unions become legalized in a lot of places. They grow. Living conditions get better for everybody. So radical socialism is significantly less appealing when your life is getting better. And another way that labor unions are suddenly able to make change and cause change and push for change is through the use of strikes, which had become legalized in a number of different countries. So you have progress independently within each country, which kind of nullifies the need for this international socialist organization. So Marx's dream of this international uprising begins to fall apart because of the success of socialism on each state's level.